Right, well, I'm John Atack, and this is my new friend, Mike Rinder, who didn't used to be my friend.
Hello again. No, we didn't used to be friends. That's exactly right. And, there's quite a number of people in my life that are like that, and
Really?
that brings me great joy, in fact. It does. It's like to know that people who once I despised or felt, ill will towards, and they despised me or felt ill will towards me, no longer do. That's a very nice thing, and it's a comforting feeling to know that your life is now filled with people who like you because of who you are and what you are, not what organization you're part of.
Yeah, or that you might be about to send them to the Rehabilitation Project Force.
Exactly. Exactly.
Oh, no. Yeah, I mean, we had some comment on our last talk. There are some people out there who are still upset with you.
I know. As much as I can, I try to make good. I know Jerry has a real difficult time ever getting over things and thinks that I'm, withholding all sorts of secret information that I haven't disclosed. And, I made an effort at one point to reach out to him, but I think that it's impossible to, as whoever it was, W.C. Fields or P.T. Barnum or someone says, you can't please all the people all the time, and I can only do my best, and I can assure Jerry and the people that go along with him that there isn't some secret cache of information that I have that I haven't disclosed, or some horrible thing. I went to the FBI in 2009 and basically spilled everything that I knew about everything over a very extensive period of time. And people say, well, it's because he's afraid of being prosecuted. And I mean, if I was afraid of being prosecuted, that would have been the time when the statute of limitations had not run on anything that I may have been involved in. And I was perfectly willing to be, if they decided that there was something that I had done that I needed to be prosecuted for, I was like, okay, that's the price of having been involved in what I was involved in. I mean, I'm happy they didn't decide to do that.
Me too.
Of course. But they didn't prosecute anybody in Scientology either. So, I'm still trying to get them to do so.
Yeah. It is astonishing that Scientology has got away with so much. I mean, I had a guy who was defending the independent movement, and he wrote to me and he said, when did the harassment begin? And I said, well, the first instance I have is the theft of the Wichita mailing lists by James Elliott in 1951, or maybe early 52. And he wrote back and said, no, after David Mayo left, when did the harassment begin? As if, the 30 years before that were not really significant. But the point is that the harassment begins with the movement itself. And
of course. I mean, the harassment begins with the philosophy of L. Ron Hubbard. Even back to the original foundation in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and Dr. Winter and Art Sepos. And Hubbard's mindset was that anybody who disagreed or questioned him and his authority was someone who was to be wiped out or eradicated or put out of the picture. And I said, and I'm not sure if you heard this, but I'll say it again. The idea of harassment and fair game is not an grown up out of the organizational mind of Scientology, because there is in fact no organizational mind of Scientology. There's only the mind of L. Ron Hubbard that creates the mind of Scientology. There's no random people that come along and develop new ideas in Scientology or new ideas for the organization in Scientology. So, you know, it is interesting that people tend to think, and honestly, I guess when I first left the Sea Org, I thought a little this way too, that the problem of Scientology stems from the difficulties or the problems of David Miscavige. And that it's the, quote, management of Scientology that is the problem, and that, you know, all things were good when Hubbard was around, and it's just gone downhill into shit since Miscavige took over. And that is a highly, highly flawed view of the world of Scientology. And frankly, you know, when I look back and I would think that way or still try and figure out how L. Ron Hubbard was a great if flawed man, that is a part of the brainwashing. And it takes a long time or a longer time to get over that. The easy step for someone to take when they're leaving Scientology is to go, this all is terrible. I don't like the fact they're taking my money or disconnecting my family or whatever the abuse is. And this isn't how Ron would do it.
What would Ron do?
This is not what Ron would do, and if Ron was around, this wouldn't be happening. Yeah, like that's like the first step out of the mindfuck bubble is to even be able to acknowledge that. But it's another giant step out of that mindfuck bubble to go, and all of this is the result of L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah, he is the cause point from which these effects emanate, and as you say, he said there have been contributions, all of them minor. Everything else he did. And
exactly.
People will give you the excuse that his temperament changed with the Sea Org, you know, that something suddenly changed, that instead of helping people by running out their trauma, he was throwing them overboard and causing trauma, that something had changed in him. Then you got the wonderful original Founders Bulletin, which upset David Miscavige so much in 1982 at the Mission Holders Conference, where somebody said, I was driven out of the body by the current L. Ron Hubbard, you know, and I'm the real one. But the point is that you go all the way back. 1949, he commits check fraud in San Luis Obispo, which is where they got the fingerprints that they used to identify his body when he died.
Right.
He, in 1949, of course, brags to his literary agent, Forry Ackerman, that he's found a technique that has more selling angles than anything he's ever thought of, and using this technique can rape women, and the next day they won't know that you did anything. He doesn't say anything about helping anybody, and the technique is Dianetics.
Right.
So his counter and other intention, as he would put it, run all the way through Scientology. But you bring up that thing that when you leave, you've got the layers of the onion to go through. And I went through that probably a bit more rapidly than most people, because I dived in deep to find out about Hubbard. And when we talked the last time, as I said, I realizing that he was a liar, and there was things he said contradicted other things he'd said. So there was no doubt he was a liar. Honesty is sanity. Road to truth has to be trod with true steps. So I sort of said, I'm going to reject it all. Most people seem to say, well, okay, the organization is bad. Miscavige is bad, but we can make a Scientology outside because Scientology is good. Then they kind of go, well, the ethics policy is a bit harsh, so we need to moderate that. Then they go, well, the organizational policy actually is a lot of people spying on a lot of other people and not really getting very much done. So we'll get rid of that. And then they're left with the tech. And that's the one that's difficult to push, because they still feel that they're going to achieve something. Now, the simple point is this: there are no clears, not one, by his definition. There never was. You know, I interviewed John McMaster at great length, the world's first real clear. I've got 6 hours on tape with him. And,
do you really?
Oh, yes.
That must have been fascinating. That must have been absolutely fascinating.
John turned out to, you know, he was so beloved of all of the people that you talked about. People say, oh, McMaster was wonderful. He was incredible. The man I met in 1984 was an alcoholic who no longer seemed to consume food. I never saw him eat a morsel of anything other than vodka or white wine. When I suggested to him that the Gay Theatre Association, as it was then in Los Angeles, might be a good contact for him because he was evidently gay, I got an outraged 7-page denial of him being gay. I then talked with Otto Rose, who called his secretary over, and he said, come and tell John what you heard on the phone when John called me. And he'd said something about wanting to give Otto a blowjob. So the denial was incredible. The second time I visited him, he lived in squalor. He lived in this tiny little squalid apartment. You know, second time I visited him, he said, I want to record the conversation, because that's how he spoke. And he pressed the play button on his machine instead of the record button. And out came exactly what he'd told me the first time I interviewed him. So I remember I'd asked him, how did you get into Scientology? And he said, I was born in Durban. And we got the whole thing. His case is quite incredible. He was a man who had stomach cancer, had part of his stomach removed, and in his first auditing session, something happened. Hypnosis is interesting. Something happened so that he was no longer in pain. But beyond that, the next time I heard about him, I was staying in Sun Valley, you know, in Los Angeles County, and he'd been in the house a few months before that I was staying in, and the woman running the house said I had to throw him out because I had 2 teenage daughters, and I came home one day and he was chasing his boyfriend round the house naked at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Oh my God.
So no problems at all with his homosexuality. The fact that he sought to conceal it, the fact that he was put forward as the world's first real clear. I mean, there's another story that comes out of that. I had a phone conversation with a guy who was in Hollywood, he's a set designer, and he said, you know, he said, I was one of the first 10 clears that Hubbard made in 65. And he said, the thing I've never understood is that why 7 of us were gay. How was it that 7 gay people? I said, you haven't worked out the blackmail possibilities here, you know. So, you know, Hubbard was really hedging his bets and making sure he could control these people if he needed to. But so there was no state of clear. Nobody had perfect IQ, total recall, you know, was emotionally...
Didn't catch colds,
any of that stuff. It was
threw
all
away their glasses.
Yeah. So, I mean, Helen O'Brien, who ran Scientology and ran the Philadelphia doctorate course, she was the head of the Hubbard Association of Scientologists. She told me that they put a fishbowl on the counter for all of the spectacles that were going to be thrown away. And she said in, I think, 18 months, nobody threw their glasses away. And of course, Hubbard wore spectacles for his short-sightedness to the end of his days. He also had asthma, bursitis, lots of things that are on the list of things that have occurred. It doesn't work. And that's
right.
The hardest thing to get through, because people get high doing it. They get very good indicators. They feel great. And so they're sure it works. And you go, well, look, cocaine's a lot cheaper and a lot less dangerous if you want to get high. But being high is not. You know, it's having better relationships, you know, doing more good in the world. Those are the results of real therapy.
Right.
But people get into the labyrinth, into the language trap that it creates.
Yes, and I think, John, also one of the defining characteristics or defining things of Scientology is the e-meter.
Absolutely.
Because nobody else has come up with this incredible gadget gimmick that proves that everything that's said is right. Like, it's like having your own little machine that convinces people that the bullshit that you're feeding them is actually high quality nourishment. because the little machine tells them that it's high quality nourishment. And all they need is that sort of reinforcement, and they are happy as clams, so to speak. And
we won't get into that, yeah.
and
Boo-hoos and weepers.
Yeah, and it's quite. I have not yet figured out the truth of the value or the reality of the e-meter, because I talk a lot, and I've mentioned to a lot of people. I watched this fascinating documentary by this guy called Tom Shadyac called I Am, and Tom Shadyac was a very successful guy in Hollywood. He did the Jim Carrey Pet Detective movies, and he had a real career. And he had a terrible bicycle accident and nearly killed himself. And he decided that he was going to travel the world subsequent to that and find out the real meaning of life, that he had come close to death and he wanted to understand. And one of the things he does is he visits these quantum physicists or something, and they've got this little meter. And it's just like an e-meter. It's like a little Wheatstone bridge. And they say, we've been sort of looking into this, and there is and I won't get into what their theory is or how they explain it, because I'm sure I'll get it wrong. But literally, he sits at a table, and they have a bowl of yogurt. And, of course, yogurt is live culture. And they put two little electrodes in the yogurt and attach it to this little meter, and they ask him about various things, and then they ask him about his divorce, and the meter goes crazy. He gets really upset. This is a very painful experience for him, and he gets very upset, and the little meter starts reading brrr, and they say, that emotion can be transmitted through some other form than, having a wire attached to you. And I thought, well, I have had the experience myself of walking into a room and sitting down and knowing that the person in the room was upset, but not even having looked at them.
Was there any yogurt involved in doing that?
Yeah, I
smeared them with yogurt.
I smeared the person with yogurt so I could sense what was going on. In any event, people may think I'm crazy, but somehow or another, there is something about that e-meter that has some kernel of validity to it, and that kernel is translated into, like the rest of Scientology, into this monstrosity of, quote, technology that explains everything. I mean, the number of people that you can talk to, John, who say, well, tell me about your experience on OT3. What did you think when you opened up that pack and read about Xenu and the volcanoes and blah, blah, blah? And almost to a person, they say, I thought it was bizarre. Well, why did you go on with it? Because the supervisor told me just see what reads on the meter.
Yep.
You don't have to believe this. It's what does the meter say? Yep. And lo and behold, because I did it, you go and sit down, and suddenly you're getting all these big reads on the e-meter, and you're told what they all mean.
Yep.
I have no idea what they really mean. They could mean that I was thinking about ice cream or, hitting a six in cricket. I have no idea what the reality is, but I know that this device separates Scientology from everything else in the world of cultic brainwashing, because it is actually something that is presented as scientific proof that this works, and every Scientologist buys it. They all believe in the e-meter. They believe in the e-meter more than they believe in L. Ron Hubbard, because they're hammered to believe in the e-meter, and it's inculcated and indoctrinated. And so but I can't say that I'm a physicist. And, you know, I've had interesting conversations with someone who used to be the world's expert on e-meters at the Gold Base, who posts often comments on my blog. A super, super smart guy, super smart, like a electronics genius.
Yep.
He was the guy that could solve any electrical, audio, visual problems, and that was what he did. And he's absolutely fabulous.
Yep.
And he hasn't been able to fully haven't been able to fully satisfy my questions about this. I'm still like a puzzled person.
Let me tell you
the subject of the e-meter.
So
tell me what your thoughts are.
A couple of little stories. Firstly, e-meters were used in the 1920s. Carl Gustav Jung used one and decided that it was not accurate enough for what he needed. Volney Matheson, of course, designed what is called the Hubbard electropsychometer. You'll notice the use of, he decided to call it Hubbard. The original meters could actually give you quite a nasty shock. As far as precision instruments go. The Wheatstone bridge, as you accurately describe it, is used in polygraph lie detectors and has been for quite a long time. And the polygraph is not accepted as a scientific instrument because it's been demonstrated that it's easy to fool. As the founding member of the C Project or C organization, Nev Chamberlain, who is well known among ex-Scientologists and Scientologists, Nev said to me once, if you have a problem in a confessional, just look at the wall and think of a flower. And I had never thought to do that. I'd always thought you were meant to be truthful, because if ethics is out, tech won't go in. So he had a different perception. But here is the clincher. A guy called Barry Pemberthy, who used to repair e-meters at St. Hill in the 1960s, he and his friend who repaired the meters, they couldn't work out why the cheapest possible components were used. He said they're still using germanium transistors in these things, and that meant nothing to me, but apparently it's a terrible thing to do because they're really cheap. And he said, so what they did was, they said, well, what about if we made a meter using the most expensive components possible, the best? So the jewel, the diamond on which I think it's the diamond, on which the needle pivots in their machine cost more than all of the components for a Mark V e-meter. So they built their meter, they set it up using pen tracers on a Mark V and on their meter, and they put the same stimulus into both meters, and then they thought, well, we'll go to the pub and have a drink, because that's what you do after that. When they came back, they found that the Mark V had recorded twice as many readings. And so they went, oh, our meter's not working. So the next time they tried it, they sat and watched. And they found that 50% of the readings on the Mark V were generated within the machine. Now, this, later on we get in, about 1980, what's called silver sealing on e-meters, that you had to pay every year to have your e-meter checked. The reason they were actually... Silver certing. There you go. Sorry. My misunderstood word. So they
well, you went blank. So
that's it. Silver surfing, something or other. The meters were coming back in because they had the tone arm is a potentiometer, and it was a carbon potentiometer, and it meant that every time you turned it, it was giving off dust. This dust, and you must have seen this because I certainly have. You can watch an e-meter that's not got anything plugged into it rock slamming. You can just switch one on without putting any cans on it, and the old Mark Vs and the Mark Sixes, you could watch them rock slamming. They were doing something to themselves. What they were doing was the spare carbon that was coming off was causing interference in the meter. If you then, I don't remember how many of the crew at the Flag Land Base were put on the Rehabilitation Project Force because they had rock slams, but it was quite a lot. that was the meter reacting, it wasn't the people. Of course, side story, Otto Roos, when he examined L. Ron Hubbard's auditing folders in 71, 72, found 200 rock slams. So as they are evil purposes, that he did point out to L. Ron Hubbard, that meant he'd got evil purposes, and he found himself standing on the dock with his passport and no money. That's what happened. But the ability meter was the outcome of this. Barry Pemberton made it finally in the 1980s and made a meter that is that much more accurate. So to start off with, you've got a defective machine.
Right.
When Texas Instruments quoted to make the Mark 7, they said they could make it for $38. It sold for $2,000. Right? So you've got this hokum going on, which is about believing in this machine. Now, as I say, with the polygraph, it's been shown to be inaccurate. The reasoning that's normally given is that it responds to changes in the sweat glands in the palm of the hands. Not that they are becoming sweaty, but that the glands themselves are going through some transformation because of the electricity passed through them. That means that occasionally it could be that your electrical resistance does indicate some change. But as they found with the polygraph, what's being indicated is anxiety. So if you put a psychopath on a polygraph, they don't react. The e-meter won't work on them. If you put somebody who's feeling nervous, they'll confess to the crime, even though they didn't commit it. So it's not a scientifically accurate instrument, is the point.
Oh, of course not. Of course not. It just fascinates me, the subject itself of whether you can measure anything with it. You know what I mean? Like, is there anything about it that is valid? Because it seems there is something, but I don't know what that is, and but I know in general it's a lot of hokum, because there are a lot of people who, subsequent to leaving Scientology, said, well, yeah, in the end, all I did was I thought about ice cream, I thought about this, I thought about that. I just would wander in my imagination in order to get a floating needle, and that was my technique to get out. And so clearly it does not work unless you believe it works. And then it's not necessarily working as it says it works. It is accomplishing the objective of, just like you said, I believe I should tell the truth. I believe that the meter will tell me if I'm telling the truth. So I better blurt out everything that I got, because that's the only way I'm going to make it to my spiritual salvation. And that is and that's why I said it's a pretty brilliant thing to have brought in a gadget that apparently verifies the veracity of what Hubbard says auditing accomplishes, or sec checking accomplishes. And that's pure genius, because you also sell the damn thing for $5,000, and it costs, a couple of $100 to make, and you require that everybody has to have 2 of them. And it's like the perfect scam.
And Hubbard himself tested this, and there's a book about it, and the book is Mission into Time, where Hubbard went and discovered these elements of his past lives by the fantastically accurate instrument of the e-meter. And what they found was a few bottle tops. If you talk to Hannah Whitfield, Hannah Eltringham as was, who was the captain of that mission, she is very reluctant in terms of anything having been discovered. And there is this one thing, which is that the meter is used to find your past lives. And this is very important to people who've not been involved in Scientology to understand that a large part of what happens in your counselling or auditing is you remembering incidents from former incarnations. And when you actually, so you take somebody and say, well, I lived in China in 300 BC. And you say, fine, talk to me a little bit in the language you spoke then. Now, as yet, I've not met anybody who could remember the language they spoke in their past lives. And that seems a little bit weird, that they can they can have a visual memory of it, but they've got no aural memory of it. They can't tell you what they're hearing. They can't suddenly read Latin or Greek. And I had a friend who, having left Scientology, still really believed in this. And he gradually, over time, constructed an image of a past life that he'd had in this other town, a place in England that he'd never been to. And eventually, to convince his wife, who didn't believe any of this, he wrote down a description of the place and what it was like, where everything was, and they went and visited. And he found that the town had actually been built after the time he believed he'd lived there. There'd been nothing but fields there. There was nothing in the town that was the same as his recollection. Those sort of tests would be very easy to make, and Scientology has profoundly avoided them from 1951, when past lives first started to be audited after Science of Survival, to now. Nobody has bothered to try and prove one of these things. Except, of course, for Have You Lived Before This Life, another book where the names of the people whose past lives were being tested have been taken out since the first edition, because one of them was Cyril Vosper, who would later write The Mind Benders. Though curiously still believed in past lives to his dying day, because Cyril was a friend of mine, but there you go. But the evidence being presented is pathetic. It's just people, I said this, nobody goes and checks. So as you say, you have a pseudo-scientific instrument which will, exactly as you say, I remember talking to a guy who got in the 50s, Derek Guy, something like that. He got in the 50s and he was really into it all, and then he saw OT3 and he went, my heart just fell. I'd been involved in this thing since like 1954 or what have you, and here I am going, oh no. And the supervisor said, see what the e-meter does. And he said, an e-meter read. And I said to him, and did you ever check the e-meter? Did you ever think about whether that was accurate or whether it might be just reflecting something that you wanted to believe in, as opposed to something that was in fact true? Is it actually an accurate way of detecting the truth? Has that ever been checked? Because it'd be very easy to check. You get somebody to answer 100 questions, you double blind it so that the person getting the answers doesn't know whether they're true or false, and then you check how many you got right.
Yep.
And you do it on 1,000 people, of course, to make it a gold standard study. But Scientology, the science of mind, has never been scientifically tested, since they got a little bit of a problem in the first Los Angeles Foundation when they did run studies and none of it worked. Hubbard talks about it in Science for Survival and says that they used pain drug hypnosis on somebody in Los Angeles and were unable to recover the engram. So they beat somebody up, gave him a good kicking, said some things to him, and that's science for you, though. You have to work hard and get hurt sometimes in science. Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
I know, and it sort of touches upon something that is also so fascinating about the history of Hubbard and Scientology, is his repeated claims of the most rigorous scientific research that goes beyond, what any normal scientist would do in order to verify all of this information that he comes forward with. And that's an article of faith in Scientology.
And he makes clear statements about it. For example, LSD, years after they have come off LSD, he says, on research into 2 cases I have found. One of them was Harvey Haber, who told me that he and somebody else had offended Hubbard. So he had them go through their folders, and the only thing they could find in common between them was they'd both taken LSD. So Hubbard basically reprimands Haber and this woman by saying people who've taken LSD are stupid. People, Hubbard himself had taken LSD. I've talked with 2 people that he talked about this with. But his research, the fact that he admits that his research was based on 2 cases.
I know.
No science
and there are numerous examples of that, John. I mean, the purification program is the same thing. It's like having a few people run around in rubber suits.
Jerry Armstrong being one of them, of course.
Yeah, yeah, I know. And the same thing with the introspection rundown. I mean, John, I was there for the quote research and development of the introspection rundown, sitting outside the cabin of Bruce Welch on the Apollo. And that was my first assignment when I arrived on board the ship. Sit outside this cabin with this guy screaming and having a complete psychotic episode night after night after night. And that became that one example with Ron Shafran eventually coming down and daring to go into this room with this guy and sit him down on an e-meter and do some Hubbard invented processes that suddenly got written up as the answer, the final solution to the need for psychiatry on planet Earth. I mean, that's what that bulletin says.
Yeah,
the introspection rundown says, I have finally discovered and solved the last reason for psychiatry to be needed on this planet. And it was based on Bruce Welch. Bruce Welch, who came out of his psychotic episode, went back and was then offloaded from the Apollo by Stuart Moreau. And then Hubbard said, why did you offload him? He was perfect. And it was like crazy. It was like the craziest thing. And of course, that introspection rundown is then the basis for the quote treatment of Lisa McPherson, which resulted in her dying.
Yeah.
And there's no thought in the minds of Scientologists to go, wait a minute, is any of this real? Did any of this really happen? Why is it that Hubbard says that Clears will have this and that, and he's done all this made all these discoveries and blah, 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 but none of it ever came true? How did he come up with the Piltdown Man in History of Man?
Yeah.
Like, and History of Man is a book of magnificent chutzpah. That book is astonishing in its utter conviction that you can fool people 100% if you assert it enough. That you can get a certain percentage of people to buy anything that you are selling.
You can fool some of the people all of the time. Yeah.
Yeah, if you are certain enough about what you're saying, because, that's the book that Hubbard came out with that supposedly was the proof of the e-meter. That I know you mentioned Science of Survival, and Past Lives, but this was really the start. I mean, this was I'm embarking on a new scam, Dianetics, I've lost it, so I've got to come up with something else, so here's Scientology, and boy, I'm going to zoom them for real this time, because the stuff that's in there is batshit crazy.
Yeah, and I mean, you start with the opening line. This is a cold-blooded and factual account of your last 60 trillion years. Well, let me tell you, it took me 7 years to research Scientology and its history, which covered, by that time, 40 years. How are you going to research 60 trillion years in 2 weeks using only one huge bag of amphetamines, Mary Sue Hubbard, Nibs Hubbard, and an e-meter? You've already started with something that's crazy, but amphetamines obviously speeded him up tremendously. And he was a fast researcher. In case anybody disbelieves me, Dianetics Modern Science of Mental Health to this day still talks about grabbing hold of Benzedrine, the amphetamine to use, and there are many lectures where he also talks about that. As you say, by February 1952, because the New Jersey Medical Association was suing for practicing medicine without a license, because all 5 foundations had gone bankrupt because Hubbard had spent the money.
Taking all the money.
Yeah. So Don Purcell in Wichita rescues Hubbard, says, it's all right, I'll look after it. I will take on the court cases. So Hubbard sells him Dianetics, including the book, everything, the name, for $1. And then when he gets to court, the judge says to Purcell, oh, you can have the lot for $800. And suddenly Hubbard finds that he doesn't own it anymore, starts attacking Purcell, who's got nothing against him, ends up in Phoenix, Arizona in February 52, and out of whole cloth has to develop a new subject, for which he looks very much to the work of Aleister Crowley. Very much. I've written a paper called Possible Origins of Dianetics and Scientology 25 years ago that gets into the many aspects, like creative processing, the basis of the Philadelphia Doctorate course. They come from Aleister Crowley. OTTR0 comes from Aleister Crowley. And he makes up all this stuff in that year, which will eventuate, as you say, in the book called What to Audit and retitled Scientology, A History of Man, a cold-blooded and factual account of your last 60 trillion years, when you used to be a boohoo or a weeper, a clam, just, and the Piltdown Man is true at that time still. And they never even bothered to change that in later editions after the Piltdown Man's been proved to be a hoax.
Right. And how is it that is still, like, it's hard sometimes to think back and go, how did I manage to rationalize that? It's so crazy. Like, just that single example of the Piltdown Man, it's provable that was disclosed as a complete hoax subsequent to the writing of that book.
Yeah, they did a later thing where they actually left a cricket bat with one of the skeletons to see if they worked it out that it was a hoax or not. People want to believe,
Yeah, but at the time, that was not known to be a hoax. So
No.
Hubbard puts it in the book. For those who don't know, Hubbard lays out this supposed factual history of man for the last 60 trillion years, and all these things that happen to everybody that cause you to have toothaches today because once you're in an earlier period you had, you were a clam sitting on the beach and sand got in your shell and it caused you to weep, and like all of this really bizarre stuff.
And you smoked cigarettes because you're frightened of volcanoes. And this from a man who smoked 100 cigarettes a day and could never get past his fear of volcanoes, which erupted again in OT3, terrified of volcanoes.
Yeah, but in this cold-blooded factual account of everybody's history is the incident of the Piltdown Man. When you supposedly, on the evolutionary chain, went through the stage of being the Piltdown Man, and how that affects you, and what reactions you have in your current existence because of the experiences that you had as the Piltdown Man. Well, subsequent to the book being published, the Piltdown Man, as an evolutionary step in the chain of, ape to Homo sapien, was disclosed to have been a very elaborate prank. And yet that is still contained in this book. And as John says, in the current edition of the book is the factual cold-blooded factual account of your last 60 trillion years, including the fact that you may have incidents from when you were the Piltdown Man. And that doesn't seem to strike a chord with anyone. Like, I've written about this on my blog about 4 times because it's just so clear-cut fascinating. It's not a matter of opinion. It is just that's reality. And you don't seem to be able to persuade anybody that is a believer of reality.
Well, let me take a side issue here, which is I talked with the former commanding officer of the St. Hill Foundation, and I said to her, look, here's a place where Hubbard says in my philosophy, in 1965, he was crippled and blinded at the end of World War II. He spent a year in hospital, crippled and blinded. Here in 1957 is Electrical Communication and Isness, which is in the red volumes, where he says on July the 25th, I went down to Hollywood and beat up 3 petty officers. Now, 25th, 1945, August 14th, end of war. And I said so these two statements are in contradiction. He was either hospitalized, crippled and blinded, or he was in Hollywood beating up 3 able-bodied human beings. Which is it? And she said, oh, the answer is obvious. He had 2 bodies. So I said,
oh my
look,
God.
He didn't suffer any war wounds, and he admits that in an interview in December 1950 with Look magazine. Since then, Miscavige has released, I think it's 23rd September 1950 tape called Introduction to Dianetics, where Hubbard admits he didn't have any war wounds. You know, in Look he says he fell down a ship's ladder, he had pink eye, conjunctivitis, he had ulcers, and he had something wrong with his feet. And that's what you get. So I said to her, you know, he had no war wounds. And she looked at me and said, oh, yes, he did. And I said, how do you know that? She said, I served with him.
Oh, my
At which point
God.
I asked her to name any of the other officers aboard the ship with her, and she was unable to do so. But
I could have given you 1 or 2.
yeah, but you know that Thomas Moulton,
Thomas Moulton.
gave testimony, so same as me. I'd read the Navy file, though, so I'd cheated. You know.
Yeah.
The sheet-dipped Navy file.
Isn't that fascinating, John? Because it is the curse of cults, and even when I was talking to my good friend Lloyd Evans about the Jehovah's Witnesses, or Mark Vicente about Nexium, the idea that you can get people to believe the unbelievable and explain it, and that when shown that the unbelievable is actually untrue, in many instances it strengthens their conviction.
Cognitive
It doesn't
dissonance
undermine
theory.
it strengthens it. Like
Yeah.
when the founder of the Jehovah's Witnesses started telling people that the world was ending in 1928 or whatever, he first
1914,
started.
I think, was about the
14 was
first,
the first one, and then it
Which
changed
came
to
close.
28, and then it went to 73, and then it went to 87, and every time the day comes and goes, they come up with the explanation that, you know, varying, but they come up with a new explanation, and it just convinces these people more that they have to have even stronger faith, because this is a test of their faith. This is a test of their ability to make it through when prophecy fails.
This is Leon Festinger's 1954 book where he predicts, having tested a cult that was actually related to Scientology, that when your certainty is challenged, it will become more rigid in the majority of cases. So this is the most tested theory in psychology, by the way.
Interesting.
And you know, it's a UFO cult that the woman has a live-in Scientology auditor at the time. This is 54. And she says, the world's going to end. We've got to go on this mountaintop. The mothership will come and get us. And what Festinger said was, and he'd got 2 of his students in the group, was that when it didn't come, that the people who'd actually gone to the mountaintop would believe more fervently. Now, this relates also to something really, really important, which is the feeling of certainty. The feeling of certainty. I tell the same story every time. I was 17 years old. This born-again Christian spent 2 hours trying to convince me about Jesus. I had a friendly conversation with him, because that's the sort of person I am. And he backed away from me rather terrified. I don't know why. I must have been looking particularly vicious at the time. And he said, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true. Understand? No. And that's exactly the position. And anybody can get into it. People, scientists, you know, have believed. You know, for example, when Barry Marshall came along in the 70s and said ulcers are caused by a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori, it took 20 years to persuade medical doctors, people highly trained in science, that what he was saying was true, because the textbook said bacteria can't live in the human stomach. Not only can H. pylori live in the human stomach, it likes it more acidic in there. It makes it more acidic. So this having a paradigm and going, it must be true because the textbooks say it's true. We see it with militant atheists who are absolutely convinced that they know the truth. Well, the truth is, any of us know the truth.
Right.
As Thomas Huxley said when he invented the word agnostic, none of us knows the first cause of the universe. And Charles Darwin agreed with him, his friend Charles Darwin. And I agree with him. People become convinced and they become fervent about something. And then it's as if their whole being depends upon this being right, rather than just relaxing and saying, let's look at the evidence. Let's see what we actually know. And let's be willing to have the evidence challenged and reformulated. That's really hard to do for any of us. It's not just a cult thing, it's for anybody. We have to have our feelings of certainty, because if I can't trust my perception and my interpretation of the world, I'm lost. So if anybody challenges my perception and interpretation, I will then have confirmation bias, my side bias, that says, no, I'm right and you're wrong, and the wars keep happening and the chaos keeps occurring,
Absolutely. This country, the United States these days, is like the perfect example of that. You just can't even have a conversation these days with anybody that has a different political view. It's like a lunatic asylum let loose. The minute you have one person that, like on my blog, you get one person that makes a comment that either side of the political spectrum believes is a slight of them, it's like it sets off World War III. It's crazy. And like there's not a whole lot of rational thinking going on in any of this stuff. It's like really, really bizarre. And then when you add to it the idea that what is at stake is your spiritual eternity, it becomes astonishingly powerful. Astonishingly.
And people end up being burned at the stake at some point.
Yes. Or flying a plane into the World Trade Center or whatever. And this is what's so fascinating about this subject. I know we can sit here and sort of chit-chat and kind of laugh about it, but it destroys people and it hurts a lot of people, and it has very, very negative impact on people, this manipulation of their ability to think. Scientology is the sort of, to my mind at least, the sort of master of telling you how we're fucking you over, like very overtly, and using that. Think for yourself. Have certainty. Be certain. Don't have faith. Like all of these things that are like catchphrases in Scientology are like the things that are the traps. They like comes right out and tells you, and Hubbard comes right out and says so many things that when you analyze them subsequently, you go, whoa, he just basically said, I'm going to take you for all you've got, and you should just believe me and just follow me and do everything that I say. And on the other hand says, don't believe me, just
check everything.
Check everything yourself.
You'll be self-determined if you do exactly what I say.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
The only person who can discover technology is me.
Right.
No, you will never be at my level. You'll never be able to see the truth about anything, but I'll tell you what it is. And as long as you promise to follow and uphold command intention for 1,000 million years, you'll become self-determined. I mean, it used to be in Dianetics, you needed 1,000 hours at most to become self-determined. Now you need 1,000 million years to become self-determined.
Yeah, exactly.
I became self-determined. I left.
Yeah, me too.
I got out. Oh. It and I mean, that's what I've not spent the last 37 years studying Scientology. I moved away in '96, started to look at terrorism, radicalization, gangs, human trafficking, domestic violence, all of these things, and sort of went, the dynamics of these things are the same. That Scientology is undoubtedly the most invasive of all of the pseudo-religious, pseudo-therapy groups that are out there, largely because Hubbard never stopped talking. And he never stopped contradicting himself. You know, some idiot has said that you can't indicate a floating needle if it's not between 2 and 3.5 on the tonom. The bulletin next to that in the solo packs is the one that tells you that you can't do it. It's like he's double binding all the time. In the book Dianetics, he's saying this is not based on hypnosis. Then later in the book, he says this is completely based on hypnosis. When I interviewed Don Rogers, who was, along with Dr. Joe Winter, who you mentioned, was right there in Elizabeth, New Jersey, Bayhead, New Jersey, with Hubbard. Don Rogers said to me, when Art Sepos commissioned the book Dianetics of Modern Science and Mental Health, Hubbard turned to him and said, well, deep trance hypnosis isn't really popular anymore, so I'm going to have to come up with a new method. That new method, Dianetics, was not tried on anybody. The 272 clears that he talks about in that book, not one of them has ever come forward. It's all hokum. It's all made up. All he did was take a method used by Joseph Breuer on a woman called Anna von O, which is the first case of Freudian analysis, and said, we'll use this method. Freud explained why he'd stopped using the method before the First World War. In the Worcester Lectures, he says, because people just become more dependent upon you. What he didn't admit is the only person it had been used on, Anna von O, ended up in an asylum for her morphine addiction. She was signed in by Breuer, who'd prescribed her the morphine. This hokum just keeps on going forever.
It does go on forever. Oh, John, we get off into such philosophical discussions about things, which is absolutely fascinating to me. I don't have a whole lot more time. I don't know if there was anything that you had on your list for this particular episode that you wanted to ask that we haven't covered.
I say my list will probably go on for several years of conversations now, Mike. But I'm happy that this is a point to end, and that we can maybe reconvene in a month's time and get into the next wedge of the pie, and go further.
Absolutely, John. I thoroughly enjoy chatting with you, and it's like I said when we signed off last time. It's always such a pleasure to talk to someone that you don't have to explain everything to, and unfortunately for some people, I guess, who listen to this, that may cause things to zip by them because we're not thinking about who's maybe listening. I'm just ending up having a chat with you that's fascinating to me, and I always learn so many things from you. Thank you. I find it very helpful and somewhat therapeutic.
Good. Well, that's a good thing. It's helpful and therapeutic for me too, Mike. And I think the thing is that if we do get into too much detail, which we will at times, people can always ask us in the comments to explain things. And I can probably sell them one of my books, to explain it.
Excellent.
So this has been great. I'm John Atack. It's my new friend Mike Rinder, and we will see you again sometime.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much. Was there any yogurt involved in doing that?